presentation.
Okay, can everyone hear me down the back? I have also got a lapel mic because I will be wandering around during the presentation. First of all, I'll just give you an overview of what I'll be speaking to. I'll be speaking to the topics of classical liberalism, the harm principle, what is known as the body-idea distinction, the implied freedom of political communication, and the effect of Section 116 of the Commonwealth Constitution. I've got a lapel mic. The effect of Section 116 of the Commonwealth Constitution on the implied freedom of political communication. So, classical liberalism, what is it? It is a very influential political philosophy, especially within the Anglo-American political and legal tradition. But just to give an overview of it, its principles were influenced by the Glorious Revolution. It argues for a limited but effective and accountable state and a civil society in which individuals have expansive liberty. And it argues that adult individuals can and should govern themselves. Let's look at the classical liberal state. It's premised on the common law principle of freedom. Now, the common law principle of freedom predates the classical liberal state, but it is the cornerstone of the common law legal tradition. And unanimous decision of the High Court in Longy and ABC stated the common law principle of freedom very concisely. Under a legal system based on the common law, everybody is free to do anything subject only to the provisions of the law. So you're free to do anything unless the law provides otherwise. So you're free unless the law says, for example, you can't murder or you can't steal. The law may also impose a duty, so a duty of care, such as that imposed on, say, doctors and lawyers, for example. Now, I've stated the principle of freedom. It's a very briefly stated and clearly stated principle, but I just want to ask a question of the audience. Hands up, who here has studied law? Who here has, okay, hands down. Of those people who studied law, who here was ever formally taught this principle? Hands up. Okay, excellent. I asked a group of students that from a variety of law schools not that long ago. About 14 hands shot up. One of them had been formally taught that principle. And that's a travesty because this is literally rule number one in a common law legal system. Its ancestry can be traced, well, there's a good argument that its ancestry can be traced directly back to the Magna Carta. And while a number of countries have bills of rights, and certainly countries with a common law legal tradition have a number of rights, or bills of rights rather, we have instead here in Australia one great principle of freedom. So the government can't do anything unless authorised. Everyone's free until the government provides otherwise. This leads to another principle which is based on the common law principle of freedom. And it's stated thus: in public law, the rule is what is not authorised is not permitted, and in private law, what is not prohibited is permitted. So the government needs to pass laws to authorise itself to do things. And unless it authorises itself to do things, it can't do it. Okay, what does that mean? What are these two principles, the common law principle of freedom and this principle that government needs authorisation before it can act mean? Let's take a look at a couple of, well, one's a graph and one's going to be a picture. This is a diagram of, or a graph rather, of the total pages of the Code of Federal Regulations from the United States. Now, the United States is obviously a larger country than Australia, but I think the ratio of regulations will scale quite nicely, I dare say. So over here in 1950, there was about 10,000 pages of federal regulations. In 2016, there's over 180,000 pages of federal regulations. That blue space there is the increase in government power or the restriction of your freedom or both. This yellow space here is the restriction of your freedom. Let's look at another picture. That small stack of papers over there is US federal regulations as at 1960. That's what it was in 2018. Now, let's take a snapshot of what the US was like in 1960. What did the US have, which we share with it today? What did the US have? Was it a primitive society? No. It had cars, buses, trains, roads, rail, skyscrapers, aeroplanes, ships, heavy engineering and manufacturing plants, rocketry, satellites, surgery, antibiotics, X-rays, pharmaceuticals and industrial chemistry, nuclear reactors, nuclear weapons, refrigeration, newspapers, radio, TV, and it had fought and won 2 world wars, all with that small stack of papers you see on the left. What's changed? What possibly justifies this increase, which is an order of magnitude greater? Well, we have computers, we have smartphones, we have digital streaming, and while the argument can be made that the computers are responsible for generating these piles of paper because it's easier to tap things out and produce paper nowadays, does it really justify that? I say no. If anything, that small stack should have at most doubled in size, and we should be striving mightily to also, just keep it down. Now, I've heard it said that on the US frontier, lawyers used to keep or carry with them all 4 volumes of Blackstone's commentaries, and they would consult them, 4 volumes that they could fit in their saddlebags, and that was a useful guide to US law, because it was heavily based on English common law. 4 volumes, then this in 1960, and in the space of about 60 years, boom, exploded. Once again, growth of the state and limiting of your freedom. Civil society, what's that? I've referred to it earlier. Civil society is crucial to classical liberalism, but what is it? Well, Martin Krieger defines civil society. Civil society is comprised of multitudes of independent actors going about their individual or freely chosen cooperative affairs, able to associate and participate, or not, in an independent public realm with an economy of dispersed economic actors and markets undergirded by a socially embedded legal order which grants and enforces legal rights. In the operation of this society, groups are important. They're, in fact, essential. So, given all this, freedom of association is an important right. But we've got to bear in mind that freedom of association the right to freedom of association refers not only to association, but disassociation. So, you can form a group or disband a group. You can join a group or leave a group. You can prevent others from joining a group or be prevented from joining a group. You can kick other people out of a group, but also you can be kicked out of a group. Association, disassociation. 2 important aspects of freedom of association. Individual liberty. As I said earlier, in civil society, adult individuals are expected to govern themselves. But this doesn't mean anything goes. It does not mean it's a free-for-all. Rather, individuals must have values, principles, and rules that govern their actions. In short, they must have a code. And for many historically, and for many today, Christianity is that code. So let's look at the relationship between classical liberalism and Christianity. Now, I think it's fair to say that historically, classical liberalism and Christianity have had a successful working relationship. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been issues between classical liberalism and Christianity. The separation of church and state being one issue, which I'll come to shortly. However, overall, the two have worked quite well. That said, new challenges have emerged to both classical liberalism and Christianity. And one of those challenges emerges from what's been called concept creep and its effect on an influential principle in classical liberal philosophy. That principle is the harm principle. Now, the harm principle has been and remains an influential basis for making laws restricting liberty. John Stuart Mill, in the very influential book on liberty, stated the harm principle thus: "The sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually and collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilised community against his will is to prevent harm to others." Now, what does harm mean? Now, in the context of On Liberty, Mill makes clear that he was giving it a narrow definition. Elsewhere in On Liberty, Mill speaks of causing evil or injury to others by action or inaction. And against that, Mill spoke of a comprehensive liberty of conscience and an absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment. The liberty to express an opinion is similarly comprehensive and absolute. It extends to sarcasm and invective, and to language that itself is offensive or intemperate. Hence, the evil and the injury against others that can be restrained, in Mill's view, appears to be physical evil or injury. A harmful opinion, well, just doesn't cut it. Now, an important thing to bear in mind is that Mill not only thought that the harm principle informed the state's laws, but also mandates that society purports to impose on individuals. Mill noted that while social tyranny didn't penalise individuals as law did, as the state's law did, it left them fewer means of escape. Society's reach was greater than that of the state. Now, another prominent classical liberal philosopher, John Locke, spoke of the law of fashion or private censure. Thomas West notes that this law is enforced by praise or blame, honour or disgrace, acceptance or exclusion from a group. And to Locke, no man escapes the punishment of their censure and dislike who offends against the fashion and opinion of the company he keeps. The law of fashion imposed by society and the state's laws are both and can be very, very effective, very, very limiting in terms of the punishments they can impose respectively. So given that breaching the state's laws or society's laws of fashion has serious consequences, the harm that justifies these laws should be interpreted narrowly. But are there other forms of harm? Let's look at the Oxford English Dictionary and its definitions of harm. So, in noun form and verb form, there's, well, the noun, physical injury, especially that which is deliberately inflicted. That's close to Mill's definition. Material damage, also close. Let's look at the verbs. Physical, or physically injured. There's that typo. Damn, I was looking for it. Damage the health of. So again, these are quite narrow categories. But then there's these categories. Actual or potential ill effects or danger, or have an adverse effect on. This category is broader. And look, we use it in everyday conversation. Someone's prospects have been harmed. You do something that harms your chances of successfully completing a task or being successful generally. But when it comes to state laws or society's laws of fashion, what you have is a narrow definition, and it has to be a narrow definition. That said, harm is being given an increasingly expansive definition, particularly amongst some quarters. It's been subject to concept creep. Now, what do we mean by concept creep? Nick Haslam of the University of Melbourne has noted that a number of concepts have experienced concept creep. That is, they have expanded to include qualitatively and or quantitatively different phenomena. For example, trauma. This is the example he gives, one of others. But let's look at trauma. Trauma traditionally invoked intense fear, terror and helplessness that was outside the range of human experience and would induce significant symptoms of distress in almost everyone. Now, however, Haslam notes, trauma need not evoke any of these things. Trauma has now been expanded to include less intense and more commonly experienced phenomena. Consequently, trauma appears to have lost significant conceptual rigour. Something highly stressful, but not intensely or exceptionally so, may be thought traumatic. Similarly, the harm sufficient to justify legal intervention has experienced concept creep. Now, it need not involve bodily harm or material damage. Now, before I go on to the next slide, which provides an illustration, I'll just note that something Lorraine Finlay, Augusto Zimmerman and I wrote. Mill formulated the harm principle when harm did not have the expanded meaning that some would give it today. A government protecting against these expanded harms may undermine its liberal democratic basis. For example, a government may purport to protect people against expanded harms by prohibiting offensive speech. However, doing so may choke the freedom of expression necessary for effective liberal democratic government. So let's return to the birthplace of classical liberalism, birthplace of Mill and Locke, Great Britain. Per the Times of the newspaper in Britain, in Great Britain in 2017, more than 3,300 people were detained and questioned last year over so-called trolling on social media and other online forums, a rise of nearly 50% in 2 years. Bear in mind, they're being detained by police and questioned by police. The National Police Chiefs Council, NPCC, defended the rising arrest figures, saying officers had improved their ability to combat crime online as it continues to grow. The NPCC said forces had adapted well to the changing nature of harm in our society. Now, let's be clear about this. Some of the trolling no doubt concerned specific threats of imminent physical harm, and that's perfectly within the realms of criminal law. You just can't threaten people with a specific and imminent threat of violence. However, others were no doubt online comments that only caused offence. And what we see is that as the nature of harm has changed, the crime grew. So what do? Lorraine, Augusto and I, in no offence intended, developed the body idea distinction. And that we did that in order to resolve emerging issues concerning how the harm principle is applied. And in doing so, we need to answer the following questions. And they're pretty basic questions, though it's funny how often they're overlooked. What is being harmed and how it's being harmed? We hear, and just to branch off just slightly at this stage, who here has heard of the notion of safe spaces? Hands up. Yeah, safety. Safety is another term that has been subjected to this concept creep. We think issues such as safety, you have to ask these questions. What is being kept safe and how it's being kept safe? Anyway, let's look at the body-idea distinction. In summary form, humans are unique amongst species in their capacity for conceptual thought. This capacity differs in degree, if not in kind, from other species. That is, unless prevented by age or infirmity, humans will exercise their capacity for conceptual thought, will think and will talk. Further, human individuals, each being unique in time and space, will each have their own unique perspective on things. That said, there is a qualitative difference between the beings with the capacity for conceptual thought and the products of that capacity for conceptual thought. There's a difference between the beings capable of conceptual thought, humans, and their products, ideas. So there is a distinction, in short, between producer and product, between creator and creation. Now, attacking an idea is fundamentally different to physically attacking a person or property. It is permissible to attack an idea, even one that someone values deeply or regards as fundamental to their identity. It is not permissible to physically attack the person who holds the idea or property embodying the idea, or people or property generally. Further, all beings with the capacity for conceptual thought, the producers of conceptual thought, are intrinsically equal. We're all equal in inherent value. However, the products of that conceptual thought, ideas, are not equal. The notion that all humans are equal in inherent worth is salutary. The notion that all ideas are equal in inherent worth is untenable. Some ideas are better than others. Okay, let me illustrate this whole notion of drilling down into underlying ideas with Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, which has come up more than once during this conference. Just to reiterate Section 18C, it makes unlawful an act reasonably likely in all the circumstances to offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate a person or group of people because of their race, colour, national origin, or ethnic origin. Somewhat curiously, however, the Racial Discrimination Act does not define race, colour, national origin, or ethnic origin. Now, that creates a serious issue in its own right. We explore that in more detail in No Offence Intended. But let's box on. So what the Racial Discrimination Act does instead is rely on definitions given in two cases, at least as regards race and ethnicity. It relies on definitions provided in two cases, King Ansell and Police, and Mandler and Dowley. Let's look at King Ansell. So in King Ansell, it defined race or ethnic origin, whether individuals or the group regard themselves and are regarded by others as having a particular historical identity in terms of their colour or their racial, national or ethnic origin. This must be based on a belief shared by members of the group. Now, the italics here are my emphasis. They're not found in the case itself, but I want to return to these words. As to ethnic origin, it said, a segment of the population distinguished from others by a sufficient combination of shared customs, beliefs, traditions, and characteristics derived from a common or presumed common past, even if not drawn from what in biological terms is a common racial stock. In Mandler, the definition of an ethnic group included a long shared history of which the group is conscious, a cultural tradition of the group's own, and a common religion. But let's unpack these concepts, culture, history, and so on. A culture of a given group is comprised of its beliefs and practices. Both beliefs and practices are ultimately founded on ideas. History refers to events, and there are two forms of events. There's more, I'm not intending to be exhaustive here. It's comprised of natural events and human events. Natural events include things like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tidal waves, storms, cyclones, and hurricanes. Human events concern human actions, but these actions originate ultimately from ideas. I think I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. What about nationality and religion? Nations, per Benedict Anderson, are what Anderson says are imagined communities. National identity includes ideas about the nation's history in terms of human events, traditions, values, and culture. All these things, traditions, values, and culture, are in turn based on ideas. What about religion? Religion or religions are comprised of ideas concerning spirituality. Just another thing before I go on. The public-private dimension. Now we go on about, we touch on the public-private dimension in no offence intended, but it does provide another important aspect of the body-idea distinction. Basically, if you can be perceived by another person who can exercise their capacity for conceptual thought, you're in public. In the presence of another, you're in public. You can be seen by another through a camera, you're in public. It's important to get behind those four walls and close the door. And also, has anyone got an Amazon Alexa device? Yeah, you're never private around that. Throw that out if you want privacy. Important warning going forward. Anyway, others exercising their capacity for conceptual thought may form ideas about your actions, even though you're even your very presence. If you can be seen by someone who can exercise their capacity for conceptual thought, they'll form a view, or they may not, but they might, and you've got no control over that. So your presence and actions can be and are subject to public comment. So what should the law protect? Laws should protect people and property from physical damage. Laws should only protect ideas themselves in limited circumstances. And that's because physically damaging a person or property is qualitatively different from damaging an idea. So where does this leave Christianity? Christianity is a religion. It's comprised of ideas. But keep in mind that these ideas are powerful ideas. Christians should not be afraid to speak in favour of these ideas, and they should not be afraid to have these ideas attacked. Now recall the example of Christ, who engaged in arguments with Pharisees. From these arguments we learn more about such things as the nature of marriage, and more about the relationship between religion and government. Recall also the example of early Christians who preached and argued, often in hostile environments, including under threat of persecution. As it turned out, their ideas proved powerful. So, laws should not prohibit Christianity's ideas from attack. Our ideas are powerful, can take care of themselves. However, like it protects the bodies of other people, laws should protect Christians from physical attack and damage. And like it protects other physical property, laws should protect churches from physical attack and damage. And these arguments apply by analogy to all other religions. The next topic I want to speak to is the implied freedom of political communication that has been derived from the Commonwealth Constitution. Now, just want to venture a comment before I go into the nuts and bolts of this freedom. No, actually, I'll come back to it. Let's run through the guts of the implied freedom. I won't dwell on the test that the High Court uses to determine whether or not the implied freedom has been impermissibly infringed. It's too technical and, not enough time.
2-3 minutes.
No worries. Is this a half-hour presentation or a 40-minute presentation? Okay. Have I gone through 40 minutes already? Wow, okay. So I won't take up too much more of your time. At its core, the freedom of political communication implied from the Commonwealth Constitution is founded on the following constitutional principles. Firstly, Australian parliaments have plenary powers to make laws. Between them, Australian parliaments, Commonwealth, state and territory, can legislate with respect to anything. But the Australian people exercise popular sovereignty over the Commonwealth Parliament and, depending on where they live, state or territory parliaments. It follows that the Australian people should be able to speak about anything about which their parliaments can or should legislate. This means they can speak about anything. So, that took a lot of thinking. And this took even more thinking. In short, the plenary powers of Australian parliaments plus the popular sovereignty of the Australian people equals a strong and wide-ranging implied freedom. Yeah. That took a lot of thinking, but it's easily stated. And it means that the implied freedom is almost as powerful as the US First Amendment. But we've yet to work through that implication fully. Now, the implied freedom is an indispensable incident to Australia's system of government. The implied freedom applies not only to Commonwealth, but state and territory legislative and executive action. But what is an indispensable incident? Indispensable incidents appears to be those things that are necessary to the function of Australia's system of government. So just going back. This is the machinery of Australia's constitutional government, but it can't work without this. We've got to be able to speak about anything, or virtually anything. As oil is indispensable to the operation of an engine or machine, so is freedom of expression essential to the operation of these sectors of government. If the oil isn't there, the machinery begins to grind, and then it breaks down, and it could explode. We need that. It's indispensable. Yeah. So it's not an emanation of a penumbra, it's an indispensable incident. Just recalling what was said last night. No, it's there. Freedom of association and the implied freedom. Note that freedom to associate about government and political matters may also be an indispensable incident. Freedom to associate about government political matters is treated as a corollary of the implied freedom. But this freedom includes the freedom to formally organise about government or political matters and dissociate from or exclude those who disagree about a government or political matter. So there's a good argument that freedom of association is also necessarily implied from the Commonwealth Constitution. It is an indispensable incident. Now, Section 116 effects on the implied freedom. I'm out of time. But look, let's get Asher on, and I'll keep you in suspense. If you want me to come back to this, I'll leave you hanging. If you want me to come back at this, and if we've got time after Asher's presentation, I might reconvene. But let's get Asher on first, because I've bitten into her tongue enough already. Thank you.